Well, it's that time of year again. Welcome to my 8th annual winter outlook across the state. I was going to say of Oregon, but I've actually expanded a bit across the Pacific Northwest and even into Idaho, as I actually live there now. It's been about 6 months since I've uploaded anything on this YouTube channel. Last video was my life update and tribute video for my upcoming film Counter Threat X Divine Revelation, and how I had to postpone that project until further notice due to my family and I moving to Idaho. But I am now happy to report I'm situated in my new place. I'm well, and I am now reporting from the Pocatello area in Idaho. And I have a lot of updates that I'm going to be sharing over the next couple of months, and we'll be getting back into the consistency here on YouTube with more uploads, so stay tuned for both of those things. Otherwise, what are my predictions for this upcoming winter season across the Pacific Northwest? Well, 2025 into 2026, let's see what you got. All right, let's start with the extended weather modeling that go out months. What can we infer from this map? Well, this is the Canadian models, specifically the mean sea level pressure. You see these red, yellow, and orange tones that are dropping down over the Pacific Northwest, and how this blue is dissipating and dragging even further south. Well, that could mean an increased ridges of high pressure developing over the next couple months across the Pacific Northwest. So that means, yeah, maybe we're going to be on the drier side. Let's go over to the European model. This is specifically the 500 millibar heights, which from this you can infer any mildness maybe drops further down to the south. Could that mean cooler air? Possibly. At the very least, that could be average developing over the next couple months. And this could even infer right there that white shade, that maybe that's Arctic air developing. Doesn't this kind of look similar to the maps I showed you this time last year? Yeah, but the timing looks a little bit different. If anything, it's actually shifted a little bit earlier. Well, let's see what happens after the new year. All of a sudden, the European model just shifts that mildness kind of back up towards the north, over the Pacific Northwest. Could that be warmer air? Something to watch. The Canadian model all of a sudden gets a big change, and we see the potential for an active storm track developing after the new year. So does that mean it could be more wetter? Possibly, or at the very least, normal, getting back into a typical northwest flow pattern. Okay, let's take this further. So my 2025 through 26 outlook, let's look at this weather pattern more in depth. I assume you've heard of the weather phenomenon, La Nina, El Nino, but what do those exactly mean? I'll get to that in just a second. But what you may not know as well is what's called enso neutral. The pattern we actually were in this time last year, the pattern we are in right now, and that just means it's not El Nino, not La Nina. It's in the middle. It's what you would call an average enso cycle. Okay. Analog years, a big factor in these outlooks that I do, not only looking at weather modeling that goes out months, but looking at analog years. That's basically looking at years in the past, looking through the record books, seeing what we just came out of as a season, trying to find similarities in the past and seeing what that outcome could be. And this is the odds that I ran, at least for my first 4 initial analog years, which were heavily based on the enso cycle that we just came out of. 1953 into 54, 1967 into 68, 1993 into 94, and 2017 into 18. That gives half of those years enso neutral, 25% of those years a weak La Nina or a weak El Nino, surprisingly enough. If you paid attention to NOAA, I think they said somewhere around 70% chance that we transition into our transition from our current enso neutral that we see right now into weak La Nina over the next couple months, and those odds still drop to like 54% after the new year, but they're still calling for a La Nina year overall, despite those odds dropping. Well, these analog years seem to think, well, if we don't stay Enso neutral, maybe going to weak La Nina isn't the only possibility. Maybe weak El Nino too. Or instead, I should say. Something to think about. But a huge factor which would normally destroy certain predictions for an outlook. Okay, the warm blob, or coined as the blob, is a warm area of sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific. It's a pretty new phenomenon, but what it has done in certain years has basically provided more ridging of high pressure. And maybe the stereotype is like, oh, maybe not that much snow for the lowlands or for the mountains. Obviously, that's too much of a stereotype, not only because it's such, or at least it's a newer phenomenon, but also it just, that is not a great way to stereotype that at all. So as a forecaster, I will give you what that looks like by factoring in what the warm blob could do to the Pacific Northwest. These specific years, I still used Enso cycles we just came out of as a similar influence, but the difference is you add that blob influence, which, like I said, newer phenomenon. 90 and 91, 2013 into 14, 14 and 15, 18 and 19. Notice how my initial Enso-based years were pretty old, except for the 2017 data set, and these warm blobs are much newer after 2000, except for the 1990 data set. I think that's a great way this year. Is I felt like I usually have 4 analog years. I feel like that's too little. I feel like I needed to add to 8 this year. And I do need that extra 4 analog years to try my best as I possibly can to give you a good idea, even with this warm blob influence. Enough talking. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. So how does that alter the analog? Well, if we just look at the 4 warm blob years themselves, Enso neutral is actually the same odds. 50% of them are still Enso neutral. But interesting enough, what does this do to La Nina? All of a sudden, none of them are La Nina, and the 25% odds just increased to a weak El Nino. Interesting enough. But what I will say is there's just, since it's a new phenomenon, you don't have a lot of facts about this compared to what you could with the influence of Enso cycles. So there isn't enough evidence to directly correlate the warm blob to the Enso cycles in terms of being able to change the Enso cycle, but there's enough evidence to say maybe it strengthens one way or the other in some cases, but for the most part, they're at completely opposite ends of the Pacific, as if you don't know, the Enso cycles are based on the sea surface temperatures of the equatorial waters. So there just isn't too much correlation there on them affecting each other. But what there is the warm blob has a tendency, if it's strong enough, to affect the Pacific Northwest weather pattern, maybe even more so than the Enso cycles. So I found that to be interesting. So here's my 8-year analog, Enso plus the blob factor. As I said, more ridging, something that's possible in the warm blob years. In really strong years, it could have the potential to overshadow the typical impacts of a Enso cycle. Not always, but just something to think about. If we're shifting gears just more back to what the Enso cycles typically do to the Pacific Northwest without the warm blob influence, typically Enso neutral, it's really, a lot of people generalize and it's like, oh, it's a normal winter. It's not going to be too snowy, but it's also not going to be too mild. That simply just is not true as a stereotype. The actual definition is normal equatorial waters. And across the Pacific Northwest, the storm track varies. Sometimes it's wetter than usual, sometimes it's normal, sometimes it's drier than usual. That's the true definition. An El Nino, specifically, in this case, a weak El Nino, would bring slightly warmer equatorial waters, which would typically, not always, but typically bring a weaker storm track. The opposite is true for a weak La Nina, cooler equatorial waters, typically stronger storm track. Again, not always. But combining the Enso and blob factor, here's what I would say the odds are for each Enso cycle. So 50% chance still that we remain Enso neutral, which we're in right now. And specifically the data set is a 31.25% odds that we transition into weak El Nino, and only 18.75 that we transition to weak La Nina, which would be that's definitely not what NOAA is betting on. I'm not saying that the weak La Nina has a really low chance to develop. It could still happen. NOAA could still be correct. But what I am saying is there's 50% odds either direction to either stay Enso neutral or transition into something else. Whether that be El Nino or La Nina. But either way, I expect it to be weak. Even if we do transition into it, I don't expect the temperatures, the equatorial waters, to be, I don't know, any more than, let's say, plus 0.678 degrees Celsius if we're El Nino, or negative 0.678 as a La Nina. Or it's very possible we don't do either, and we either go positive tilt El Nino or positive tilt neutral or negative tilt neutral. So that's what I'm thinking for this upcoming season. Let's get into the official forecast that I'm projecting. So taking the Enso plus blob factor as an 8-year analog, what can you expect this season? Okay, so odds of Arctic air across the Pacific Northwest. I'm going 25% chance that Northwest Oregon, so the lowlands of the Willamette Valley, Portland, Salem, Eugene, even Longview. It's not just Northwest Oregon, but typically I'm not running odds far into northern Washington because those odds actually would be different. But generally, up and down the I-5 corridor, 25% chance. Okay, northeast Oregon, like the east part of the state, and into the border towards the west part of Idaho. Wow, that really jumps up. 62.5% chance for Arctic air. And the same data set is showing an increasing chance, even higher for the southeast part of Idaho, where I'm at now. 75% odds. If we were to see that, I'm thinking that possibility would be in December to see Arctic air, something I'm watching. All right, here's the big headline. Odds of a big snowstorm or windstorm. All areas, yep, I'm not splitting it by region because somehow the odds are the same everywhere, that we get a 37.5% chance for a big snowstorm or windstorm. What do I mean by that? Well, in Portland, at PDX specifically, average, I believe, is 4.2 inches per year. And you would consider a snowstorm to be generally greater than that, like 6, 7, 8, 9 inches. But I'm talking greater than 9 or 10 inches. 37.5% odds were greater. That's what I mean by a big snowstorm. And also above 15, 20, 25 inches in terms of the east side of the state or getting into the Snake River playing across southern Idaho. That's what I mean by big snowstorm. And in terms of windstorm, generally anything above 50 miles per hour is what I'm coining as a windstorm. As you can have smaller wind events, sure, but anything above 50 miles per hour, at least in terms of wind gusts, not necessarily sustained winds, but wind gusts, 50 miles per hour extending, 60, 70, and some analog years, even as high as 80. Again, that's 37.5% chance. And if we were to see either or, because interesting enough, most years where we saw a windstorm in my analog, we didn't really see that at the same time as a snowstorm, right? We had some years where we had increasing windstorms and some years where we had increasing snowstorms. They don't necessarily happen at the same time. I guess they could happen the same year, but it's not necessarily a headline that I would rely on. That's why I'm really prefacing or here. So either one of those things I'm thinking could happen December or January. Something to watch. Okay, warm blob years surprisingly had a mix of lower and higher snowfall. There were some warm blob years that had like excessively high snowfall for the Willamette Valley. Even more so than my initial analog years. Completely more based on Enzo without the warm blob factor. Yet there were other warm blob years that had absolutely nothing across the lowlands of Western Oregon. And kind of similar way for more snowfall like east side of the state and into Idaho. There were some years in warm blob that had excessively high snow and some years that was lower, but obviously you still got snow because that's the climate in that nature. Yet, and my initial analog years could guarantee you at least something on the valley floor and a possible snowstorm, but nothing like massive. Yet, warm blob years, and this is lowland specifically, Willamette Valley, lowland had multiple that were 0, yet the higher end of something excessive was actually more. So what does that mean? Well, same odds. Either way, if you're looking at the initial analog years or the blob factor, same odds, I think, for a big snowstorm. All right, so my next headline is the warm blob years actually had less rain west of the Cascades, which makes sense. That's that ridging that I showed you in the modeling. That's the ridging that I said could be more abundant because of the warm blob. That makes sense. But what I found interesting is more rain, whether that's above average or at least normal, east into the east part of Oregon and into Idaho. Warm blob years also had a higher threat for wind events and cold snaps. So even despite that huge difference in snowfall in that range, really anywhere across the Pacific Northwest, increasing chances for at least some sort of wind event and cold snaps, okay? All years, though, even my initial ones, had a lower threat for ice storms and flooding events, so I think out of everything I just covered, that's actually the least likely to happen this year. Obviously, can't be ruled out, but generally least likely. Okay, my snow raincast this year. Okay, varying snow. That's exactly what I said last year, but the difference is where it varies. That's where you're going to notice that difference this year. And I'm calling for near to below normal rainfall. I used to do my outlooks when I first started doing the water year, which starts October 1st, ends the following September 30th. And then I just started getting the total precipitation just throughout the winter months. But then I kept expanding and lengthening my predictions month by month, because I wanted to include more of the areas that still got snow into the spring. So that's why I've increased even more this year. It's October through May, which frankly is the bulk of our moisture anyway. And at PDX, it's about 28.33, which is definitely at least somewhat below average. So something to keep in mind. But look at this. I'm going bold. Willamette Valley, Longview, Portland, Salem, Eugene, Corvallis. I'm going 4 to 9 inches of snow this upcoming season, which if you're on the low end, you're somewhere near normal, which is still more than most of you saw last year. And if we're any higher than that, we are going above normal. Again, with a 37.5% chance that this may or may not be higher than that. But I don't want to over-deliver. I'm not about that. But what I can tell you is I'm pretty confident on those 4 to 9 inches of snow across the Willamette Valley, regardless of some of those years that I actually didn't see nothing, because I think the averages outweighed the little we saw in some of those years. So something to think about. Grand Ronde Valley, 20 to 45 inches, which at the high end, that's more near normal. Any lower than that would be somewhat below normal. So that could be, I mean, at the very least, we won't see any more snow than what we saw last year. I'm projecting in the Grand Ronde Valley, you know, LeGrand, Eastern Oregon. But it actually could even be a little less than what we got last year. A lot of the data is projecting that. So that's what I'm expecting. And that precipitation in Wallowa in that October-May period is 13.68. That's actually near normal. Again, that difference between below normal at PDX, go to the east side, and now towards Idaho, and we're actually near normal. Okay, here's a new addition. I don't have government camp on here. I will explain that later. I did it only one time this past year, and I just replaced it with where I moved to. Here we go. Snake River Plain, 30 to 45 inches, which is pretty much near normal, which would still be more snow than what you received last year across the southeast portion of Idaho, but not necessarily expecting anything above normal. But at least we're transitioning from more of a mild winter into more of a normal, at least in terms of snowfall averages, which again would still be more than last year. And your precip average, October through May at Pocatello, would be just over 8 inches, which, like I said, is about average. One thing I wanted to say, even if we got 37.5% chance, if we beat those odds and we got a bigger snowstorm, I don't expect too much more snow really in my range anyway for the Grand Ronde Valley or Snake River Plain. Because if you have 1 month that just gets a massive snowstorm and other months where you just don't have the ingredients needed for a snowstorm, you could still be near to below normal, with the exception for 1 month, kind of making up for that average. So even with that, even if we beat those odds, I don't expect these ranges to be too much higher than they already would be. Although that could be different for the Willamette Valley because they're really used to not getting all that much snow. So that could be the one exception. It could go over that range if we were to get a massive snowstorm. Okay, let's time this month by month. Okay, October. We have just started the month. What do I expect? Near to above normal. And for my forecast check next year, I'll give myself a check or an X based on what I have in the parentheses here, okay? So 1 below, this is both precipitation and temperature, to 2 above. If I get that range correct, that is what I will give myself a forecast check for. So near to above normal, and that's what I'm expecting in terms of those departures. So one thing I added this year was probability of sticking snow. So yeah, obviously 0% west of the Cascades. That's normal. East side of the state and into the border towards southwest Idaho, it's a slim chance, but it's at least possible towards the end of the month. But what's much more probable is actually southeast Idaho and the Snake River Plain. I'm giving you coin flip odds on whether you get sticking snow into October, which honestly, those odds are pretty good. So I would think that's definitely the best potential anywhere across the region is to see your first sticking snow towards the end of October across the Snake River Plain. And elsewhere, we'll wait till later. Okay, November, near to below normal, anywhere between +1 or 1 above to 2 below. Probability of sticking snow in northwest Oregon, oh, well, the Willamette Valley actually goes up to about 12.5%, or all of a sudden the east side of the state and into southwestern Idaho up to 87.5% chance. So if you don't see it in October, you will absolutely see it in November. And same goes for southeastern Idaho as well. Even higher odds in towards December. This is definitely the month where we're going to see probably the most extreme kind of departure, at least in terms of below. Here we go. I'm going 0.5 to 3 at least below normal temperature and precipitation for your December. If we were to get that Arctic air, yeah, departures could actually even be lower than that, but at the bare minimum, that's what I'm expecting. So I will still, for that, if we were just to get anything cooler than that or drier than that, I'll still give myself a check mark for it, because I'm prophesizing now that if we were to get that Arctic air and really dry air as well, that could bump that down even more so. Probability of sticking snow. This odds are, based on my analog years, Willamette Valley, the lowlands, best chance for snow. My analog years think December, 62.5%. Obviously, as I said, it could still happen in January. I think if we were to see a snowstorm somewhere between December and January, even if we don't see an all huge snowstorm, I still expect the snowiest part of the season, no matter where you're at, is going to be somewhere between December and January. Analog years, specifically at least for the west side of the state, really do want December, at least in terms of sticking snow. But we'll see. I'll kind of add on to that point as we get into our next segment here. 100% chance though elsewhere, I think that's a slam dunk. Here we go. January, odds do drop a little bit west of the Cascades, 37.5, at least in terms of sticking snow. But why I think it's still possible to beat those odds? Well, if we were not to get a lot of snow in December, like the analog years at least seem to think, maybe not in terms of total snowfall, but at least the best chance of anything at least sticking, that is even as little as a dusting. It could happen in January despite those odds, because you're in that transition period. If we're really cold, we're pulling in the east wind, we're really dry, we have Arctic air, I think in that transition period to where we're probably at least somewhat warmer in comparison, maybe we see it following the Arctic air, whether that be later in December, or if we were to get it, let me preface, or into January. Also, although it's still possible to get it along with the Arctic air, but just something to point out. Although we still remain likely for sticking snow across the rest of our region into January, and there we go. It's a wild card. I mean, odds are kind of off the charts. It's really hard to nail down something, as these analog years go anywhere from 2 below to 2 above precipitation and temperature. So I'm going safe and going a near normal question mark. We'll see how that goes. February is the inverse of December. I think that's your best shot to get above normal precip and temperature. Is that starting to look a little bit more like the models I was showing you earlier? Absolutely. But this is able to kind of nail down, based on my analog years, what I'm expecting in terms of departure. So anywhere from 0.5 to 3 above, at least for those temperatures and precipitation. Whether it be a lot more than that, if we were to get that, maybe not. At least December, it's a better chance if we were to get Arctic air, those departures are more negative. But for here, I mean, with this pattern, with the warm blob, all that, I think it's probably going to be pretty hard to get anything more than these departures that I'm showing you now. Okay, interesting enough though, look at northwestern Oregon. Sticking snow odds jump up to 50% from 37.5. I don't know what it is, but PDX, the past several years, has a tendency to usually get sticking snow in the month of February. Sometimes it's your all-out snow event, like it was this past year. Other times, not so much, but at the very least, you can usually count on, for whatever reason, over the past several years, to get some sticking snow at PDX in February. The odds are kind of showing the same thing, but the reason why I don't think that would be the most amount of snow we're going to get in a season, or the chance for a big snowstorm, is because so much data is showing me that we're generally, even though we could be wetter than normal, we could also be warmer than normal. So that's why, despite odds jumping up for sticking snow, could we absolutely get that west of the Cascades in February? Yes. But for that to be the snow event that people talk about, I think those odds are pretty low given the chance for warmth we have. Okay, east side of the state and towards the Boise area, towards the border of western Idaho, 87.5, goes down a little bit and remains at 100% across the Snake River Plain across southeast Idaho. And the reason why these odds can still stay fairly high despite even being a lot warmer than normal, is because that kind of climate doesn't require what PDX or areas west of the Cascades would require in terms of those departures. So you can absolutely still get snow, and even in some cases decent snow, even with those departures being more warmer across the east part of the state into Idaho. Okay, for March, April, May, I've grouped it into I've grouped the months. It's kind of the same thing as January. It's a wild card. It could be anywhere from 2 below to 2 above, but again, near normal question mark. We'll see how that goes. Probability of sticking snow. This might look a little weird because I actually averaged out March, April, May into a 3-month probability scale here, but what you can see is obviously odds drop pretty low for any snow west of the Cascades. You know, that's typical, but you know, sometimes we do get a surprise snow in March, whether that be a dusting or an inch, but it can happen. And even more rare, a couple years ago when we got that surprise April snow, which I think it was a few inches actually, if I'm not wrong, towards PDX. So it can happen, but the odds are definitely low. And this year, if anything, I think the odds are actually even a little bit less than usual, and they're already for the most part, to get any spring snow, even if that's just a dusting west of the Cascades, okay? Still though, over a 50% chance that continues across the east side of the state, which that's typical. You usually get spring snow out towards eastern Oregon, and likely that you get that even into May, at least something on the ground towards Idaho. Okay, so I need to preface this is not a forecast. It isn't. But I wanted to show you probabilities based on my analog years. If I were to get one of these points correct, I will include it as a check mark in my forecast when I look back on my accuracy a year from now. But I just want to preface that this is not a forecast. These are just probabilities for my analog years because these are way too specific to call a forecast. If you see anybody getting that specific and calling it a slam dunk or something you should rely on, that's just not, science is not to that level yet. Just want to say that. But let's look at probabilities for fun. Okay, PDX. Mean first snow comes out on December 19th. I will say there has been some years in the past that I've done this and I've gotten pretty darn close. Other years, not even remotely close, but something to look at. And because it's so close to Christmas, chance for a white Christmas, well, this is a 12.5% chance. What's the typical white Christmas odds? 1% at PDX, at the airport. 2 downtown. So what I will say is maybe there's a slightly better chance for a white Christmas compared to what we usually do. Obviously nothing likely, but something I wanted to mention. In Wallowa, and specifically these are just for these specific airport locations because, to be honest, I don't have, the other odds that I ran was actually more true to Northwest Oregon, Northeast Oregon, Southwest Idaho, Southeast, because I combined a bunch of different locations to give you more of a odd, more selection of odds, if that's a great way of explaining it. But for here, I just wanted to pull specific airports, so just to let you know that. So mean first snow allow comes November 9th. Ooh, a 25% chance for a white Christmas. Interesting. Pocatello, mean first snow. This says October 22nd with a 62.5% chance for a white Christmas, which makes sense. Honestly, when I lived in the Grand Ronde Valley in Eastern Oregon for the past several years, I felt like more than half the years we got a white Christmas. Just the past couple, not so much because we've been more mild around that time of year. Which again, could this be the year that changes that region-wide? Possibly, so stay tuned. But Pocatello, we're even more, in general, favored to have white on the ground at Christmas. So honestly, that could be a decent bet. Something to watch. Okay, what did I do right for my winter outlook last year? Well, a lot. In fact, this was my highest accuracy I've ever seen in all my years of doing this, which is very happy to report. Okay, so first I said a weak to moderate La Nina likely, but remaining Enzo neutral can't be ruled out. You remember this time last year, I actually said that wasn't it the data set 1952 into 53? Hopefully I'm not off by a year, but I think that's right. I used that last year for last year's outlook because the year before I used it, and although on paper it may not seem as similar as what we were coming out of a couple years ago and last year, there were just a couple things I was like, you could draw some correlation of what we just came out of. And I succeeded at that 2 years ago, and now I'm succeeding in that now, and a year ago, and now. So one of those things was a above normal fire season that I, this time last year, predicted for summer of 24, which was interesting to be able to nail that. So same thing, same data set, year later. The reason why I used it is because we had somewhat similar similar temperature towards the equatorial waters for those Enzo cycles. I typically don't use anything more than 0.5, or at least this year. I think I have in years past, but this year I'm trying to be more accurate. Anything that 0.5 Celsius greater or less than what we just came out of throughout the Enzo cycles. So I used it again for this outlook, just like I did last year. That was a lot of talking. Let me try to hurry this up here. December, January, February period was negative 0.6 Celsius, which was declared a weak La Nina. Other than that period, though, we were mostly in Enzo neutral negative tilt. We were like 0.4, 0.5 below, except for that one period where we did see that weak La Nina. Okay, for that potential wind event that I said this time last year, not only I was able to correctly predict the Enzo cycle in that range I explained, that I presented, but also that potential wind event wasn't all out big storm by any means, but a November bomb cyclone we did see where max wind gusts were between like 40, 50 in the valley, and I think upwards of 70 towards the coast, and also I think the Blue Mountains too of Eastern Oregon also saw upwards of 70. So I'm going to give a forecast check as well for that. Potential flood event, again, nothing widespread, but I did call that, at least in southwestern Oregon, where we did see some problems there with that March flooding. Here's such a great point that I said last year. Trace to 3 inches of snow across the Willamette Valley, which would be below normal. I cannot get any better than that. 1/10 of an inch recorded at Corvallis, 3 inches out towards PDX. I was the only weather forecaster last year, at least locally, that I saw, that said we were going to stay below normal for the snow potential. Everybody else thought we were going into a crazy year. And if anything, those odds are higher this year than they were last year. And I was absolutely right about it last year. Forecast check. Okay, Grand Ronde Valley, 30 to 50 inches of snow, I said last year, which is pretty much near normal. This is where it gets a little unhelpful. As I said last year, the records that are kept east of the Cascades are not good. They're not like Western Oregon, where they're always kept. People continue to keep records day to day. They don't do that east of the Cascades. So I kind of have to be creative whenever I do my outlooks, specifically in terms of accumulation for the east side of the state. The best that I can usually rely on is Wallowa. LeGrand is not well. If anything, let's say LeGrand said what, 2.1 inches of snow this year? I think that's what it showed, because there was so much missing data. And I've seen a tendency where sometimes, for some reason, NA becomes 0 and it's averaged out like that. Should not be done that way. But what I can tell you is LeGrand did not get 2.1 inches of snow last year. And the normal average on their now data from NOAA is like 9 inches. Again, not accurate. Cannot rely on that. But Wallowa tends to be better. But they also tend to be more snowy too. So I always try to get a more mild data set, which is typically Union, for example. And that's exactly what I did last year. But for some reason, Union didn't really keep a record of anything. It kept some, I think maybe 9 inches or something, but I know that's not true. I lived there. That was not true, not specifically in Union, but I have a good view of the Grand Ronde Valley, and 9 inches definitely did not happen out towards Union, and maybe Union was a little bit higher than that. I don't remember, but I just know that is just not remotely accurate. So I couldn't use that to give you evidence that that I got that correct range. But what I can tell you is, okay, 43.9 inches in Wallowa, which is typically the more snowier spot of the valley. Besides me, my G station up in Somerville, 63.5 inches. That's the exception. That usually exceeds that year to year. Sometimes Wallowa's more, sometimes it's not. But the point is, that's generally a 40 to 60% or 40 to 60 inch range. And I know Union was way less than that still, comparatively. Not 9 inches, but way less than that. And I have nothing from LeGrand, which is typically more in the middle between Union and LeGrand. But I'm going to guess that Union and LeGrand were somewhere between 20 and 30 inches. So if we're assuming that, 20 to 30, upwards of 60, that would be about a 20 to 60 inch range. Call that a forecast check. About all I can do with the lack of data east of the Cascades. But I would say yes, I definitely got that right. It was near normal. Okay, another one of those instances where I said, okay, here's the mean first snowfall based on my analog years. But I gave myself a check for it. Again, I said, yeah, this is not a forecast. But I just said it for fun. And guess what? I said the November 15th for the Grand Ronde Valley. We got our first snow last year, November 16th. 24 hours within my prediction. Or not even prediction, but 24 hours within the data that came out. Yes. I give myself a forecast check for that. That was insane. Okay. October into December, I was projecting at least normal at the very bare minimum, but generally higher than that, upwards of 3 above normal, both precipitation and temperatures, or even greater than that. And that's exactly what we did. We saw 0 to 5 above statewide. I think I said what? Didn't I say like a 75% chance or something like that we would get 0 to 3 based on my analog years? Or at least I prefaced 75% of the data showed 0 to 3, and like 25% if you combined it with another data set a month later, that it could be, upwards of 3, 4, 5, 6 above normal. And yes, that exactly happened. We got 0 to 5. That was like such a great, I think it was more upwards of like 1, 2, 3 west of the Cascades. And I think places like in LeGrand and the Columbia Basin actually got upwards of like 3, 4, 5, 6 above normal, I think. I think even precipitation too. So that was an absolute forecast check. Okay, December through February, I said closer to normal, but there would be variance in those temperatures and precipitation. Exactly what happened. I said light lowland snow and or ice event with storms, quote unquote, remaining in the mountains. I couldn't have been more right. The 3-month average was bang on normal with that variance of 4 below to 4 above precip and temps statewide. And that February event that we saw west of the Cascades, it did not exceed a half an inch of ice or 4 inches of snow. And guess what? Feet in mountains. I could not have been more right with that snow forecast. So that was absolutely a forecast check. And that was also the same month of February was the most amount of snow we saw throughout the entire season across most of our region, even the east side as well. Okay, but obviously there's always things you do wrong. What did I do wrong? Well, there's definitely some, but luckily what I did right did outweigh what I did wrong. February through April, I projected, at the bare minimum, we're not going to go above normal. We're at least normal, but odds were we were going to be below normal in the temperatures and precipitation by upwards of 3 below. Also, it said there would be lighter mountain snow and even an increased chance to maybe see flakes, even if it's not widespread or an event by any means, but at least flakes, late season, out towards west of the Cascades. Well, unfortunately, that was wrong. We did have one instance where we were kind of trending towards below, at least in terms of temperatures in February. Again, that's that was our cooler than normal month statewide. Although a few stations actually had one above, believe it or not, in February. But still, 2-4 below. In another instance where we had 0 to 3 below in that rainfall out towards March. But that was just not enough for my prediction to be correct. Other than those two things, we are consistently at least near normal, upwards of 4 inches of rainfall and degrees with those temperatures above normal. And again, we also saw no spring snow in the lowlands, which I didn't say was going to happen, but I said that there was at least an increased chance that it could happen. And that was just the opposite of that, because we ended up being so much warmer than what I thought we would be for the good portion of that 3-month average. I also said we would have a potential for maybe a weaker end to the snowpack, which like that, I mean, yeah, we were warmer, but it wasn't warm enough to all of a sudden be constant rain in the Cascades or up towards the Blues. That simply was not true. So that was definitely not a good prediction. Another one that I really messed up on was, like I said, this is also why, not only because I moved to Idaho and I wanted to replace where I live with my government camp data set, but also that was my only year of doing government camp last year, and I just was not going to do that again. Much harder to predict. I set a big snow year potential in Cascades and Central Oregon, and my range was 300 to 400 inches of snow at government camp. That simply did not happen. Not even close. 193.5 inches of snow in government camp, which in fact was 38.8 inches below normal. And I didn't provide a snow range for like Bend, for example, because I mean, I feel like their data is actually even worse than LeGrand, which is already pretty bad for the record books. So I didn't give a range for Central Oregon. I don't think I have ever done that, but I did give you an example where it was like 90 inches, one analog year, and it's record snow. I did not say we were even going to get close to that much, but at the very least, I thought we were going to get above normal snowfall, and I was betting on the fact that we would with that range that we saw, or that I gave towards government camp, and that just simply did not happen. We were near to below normal snowfall in the high country, in the high desert, and out towards the Cascades. So gave myself an X for that as well. I also said a wetter than normal season, which again, this is specifically the means that I came up with October through April. Mean was 39.1 inches of precip at PDX, 14.3 at Wallowa, and 91.8 at Govey. That was nowhere near close. We were near average most areas, in fact, even below towards government camp, with 29.22% was October through April at PDX, 11.87, and only 51 inches out towards government camp. So those were my 3 points that I completely bombed this year. But one thing I will say, I have never gotten 3, as low as 3 points in the wrong category. So I'm very pleased about that. Okay, half point. I'll give myself half credit for these because I said potential widespread Arctic air somewhere between December and February. We did not do that at PDX. In fact, the lowest temperature, which occurred in February, was only 24 degrees for a low at PDX. Not even close. But Wallowa clocked in at -17 for a low temperature, which also happened in February. Because we did get widespread Arctic air in February, right before that snow event that we saw, east of the Cascades. We just didn't see it west. So forecast, check for Eastern Oregon, X for Western Oregon. Okay, and same thing for what I said, a potential weak start to high elevation snow, the snowpack. That simply just was not true for the Cascades. We had a great Cascade start despite what I said this time last year, but I included the blues in that prediction and even the valley locations of Eastern Oregon, and that was absolutely correct. We did see a weaker start than we normally would. Okay, so that's my track record for last year. What does that add up to? 9 out of 13 correct, the highest I've ever seen, which is 69.23% accurate for 2024, which is the highest that I have ever seen. For the first 4 years of doing this Outlook, it was simply more of a coin flip, or even a little bit worse than that, 40 to 50%. Though, it was still consistently better than the Farmer's Almanac, and in some years in that time frame, not too much below the industry standard. Definitely it was, but not as much as the Farmer's Almanac. And I was a child then. I did not have a lot of, critical thinking that I do now, a lot of resources that I do now. Coincidentally though, the year I turned 18, 2022, I have consistently gotten above 60% accuracy, which has generally been above the industry standard ever since, jumped up to 62.5 2 years ago, and now last year, nearly 70% accurate. So I am very pleased with that outlook. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you all this time next year, going back on my accuracy from this upcoming winter. And I hope all of you are excited to see what this winter brings across the Pacific Northwest. If I had to generalize this winter in one statement, it would be, mild at times, maybe average is near normal, with some mildness at times, except for one particular month that could be very interesting, that could bring extreme weather to the Pacific Northwest. Okay. Hope all of you have a great evening and happy winter, everybody.